Unit 7. Merriam-Webster's Vocabulary Builder. Vis comes from a Latin verb meaning see. Vision is what enables us to see. Visual images are visible to our eyes, and a visitor is someone who comes to see something. The same verb actually gives us another root, vid, as in Julius Caesar's famous statement about his military exploits, veni, vidi, vici, I came, I saw, I conquered, and such common English words as video. Vista. 1. A distant view. 2. An extensive mental view, as over a stretch of time. The economic vista for the next 2 years looks excellent, according to a poll of business economists. Vista is generally used today for broad sweeping views of the kind you might see from a mountaintop. But the word originally meant an avenue-like view, narrowed by a line of trees on either side. And vista has also long been used, like view and outlook, to mean a mental scan of the future, as if you were riding down a long grand avenue and what you could see a mile or so ahead of you was where you'd be in the very near future. Vis-a-vis. In relation to or compared with. Many financial reporters worry about the loss of U.S. economic strength. Vis-a-vis our principal trading partners. Vis-a-vis comes from Latin by way of French, where it means, literally, face-to-face. In English it was first used to mean a little horse-drawn carriage in which two people sat opposite each other. From there it acquired various other meanings, such as, dancing partner. Today it no longer refers to actual physical faces and bodies, but its modern meaning comes from the fact that things that are face-to-face can easily be compared or contrasted. So, for example, a greyhound is very tall vis-a-vis a Scottie, and the Red Sox have often fared badly vis-a-vis the Yankees. Visionary. 1. A person with foresight and imagination. 2. A dreamer whose ideas are often impractical. His followers regarded him as an inspired visionary, his opponents saw him as either a con man or a lunatic. A visionary is someone with a strong vision of the future. Since such visions aren't always accurate, a visionary's ideas may either work brilliantly or fail miserably. Even so, visionary is usually a positive word. Martin Luther King, Jr., for instance, was a visionary in his hopes and ideas for a just society. The word is also an adjective, thus, for example, we may speak of a visionary project, a visionary leader, a visionary painter, or a visionary company. Envisage. To have a mental picture of, visualize. A mere 3 weeks after they had started dating, the two were already arguing, and none of us could envisage the relationship lasting for long. One of the imagination's most valuable uses is its ability to see something in the mind's eye, that is, to visualize, envision, or envisage something. Envisaging a possibility may be one of the chief abilities that separate human beings from the other animals. What we envisage may be physical, such as a completed piece of furniture, or non-physical, such as finishing college. Envisaging life with a puppy might lead us down to the pound to buy one, and envisaging the sinking of an island nation may focus our minds on climate change. Spect comes from the Latin verb specere, meaning, to look at, and produces several familiar English words. Spectacles can be glasses that you look through, but a spectacle can also be a remarkable sight. In Roman times, perhaps a spectacular chariot race or a spectacularly bloody battle between gladiators and wild beasts, mounted for the pleasure of its spectators. Aspect. 1. A part of something. 2. A certain way in which something appears or may be regarded. Many experts believe the mental aspect of distance racing is more important than the physical aspect. Since aspectus in Latin means, looked at, an aspect of something is basically the direction from which it's looked at. So we may say that travel is your favorite aspect of your job, or that eating well is one aspect of a healthy life. If you look at a stage set from the front, it looks completely different than from behind, where all the mechanisms are visible, and both aspects are important. The word can be very useful when you're analyzing something, and it's used a great deal in the writings of scholars. Prospect. 1. The possibility that something will happen in the future. 2. An opportunity for something to happen. There was little prospect of a breakthrough in the negotiations before the elections. Since the Latin prefix pro often means forward, see pro, prospect refers to looking forward. The prospect of a recession may lead investors to pull their money out of the stock market. Graduates of a good law school usually have excellent prospects for finding employment. Prospective students roam campuses with their parents in the year before they plan to enter college. Perspective. 1. Point of view, the angle, direction, or standpoint from which a person looks at something. 2. The art or technique of painting or drawing a scene so that objects in it seem to have depth and distance. From the perspective of the lowly soldier, the war looked very different. To the modern mind, it's hard to believe that perspective had to be discovered, but before the 1400s paintings simply lacked accurate perspective. Instead, important people and objects were simply shown larger than less important ones, and although distant objects were sometimes shown smaller than near ones, this wasn't done in a regular and accurate way. Just as odd, many paintings didn't represent the other meaning of perspective either, that is, a scene might not be shown as if it were being seen from one single place. Today, perspective is used much like standpoint. Just as standpoint once used to mean simply the physical place where you stand but today also means the way you see things as a result of who you are and what you do, the same could be said about perspective. Prospectus. A printed statement that describes something, such as a new business or a stock offering, and is sent out to people who may be interested in buying or investing. The prospectus for the mutual fund says nothing about how its profit forecasts were calculated. Like prospect, prospectus looks forward. Thus, a prospectus originally outlined something that didn't yet exist, describing what it would become. This might even be a book. The Great Dictionary of Noah Webster, like that of Samuel Johnson, was first announced in the form of a prospectus, so that well-to-do people might actually subscribe to it, that is, pay for it in advance so that Webster would have money to live on while writing it. Soon, prospectus was being used to mean a description of a private school or college, intended to attract new students. Today the word very often means a description of a stock offering or mutual fund, whether new or not. Voce comes from the Latin words meaning voice and speak. So a vocal ensemble is a singing group. A vocation was originally a calling from God to do religious work as a priest, monk, or nun, though today most people use the word just to mean a career. And a vocabulary is a set of words for speaking. Equivocate. 1. To use ambiguous language, especially in order to deceive. 2. To avoid giving a direct answer. As the company directors continued to equivocate, the union prepared to return to the picket lines. With its root equi, meaning equal, equivocate suggests speaking on both sides of an issue at the same time. An equivocal answer is one that manages not to take a stand. An unequivocal answer, by contrast, is strong and clear. Politicians are famous for equivocating, but equivocation is also typical of used car salesmen, nervous witnesses in a courtroom, and guys whose girlfriends ask them how committed they are to a relationship. Irrevocable. Impossible to call back or retract. She had told him she wasn't going to see him again, but he couldn't believe her decision was irrevocable. Irrevocable has a formal sound to it and is often used in legal contexts. Irrevocable trusts are trust funds that cannot be dissolved by the people who created them. The other kind is a revocable trust. An irrevocable credit is an absolute obligation from a bank to provide credit to a customer. Irrevocable gifts, under U.S. tax law, are gifts that are given by one living person to another and can't be reclaimed by the giver. But the word isn't always legal. We've all had to make irrevocable decisions that commit us absolutely to something. Advocate. To speak in favor of. Our lawyer is advocating a suit against the state, but most of us would rather try some other approaches first. The verb advocate may be followed by for, advocated for better roads, advocated for merging the two school districts, or by a noun or gerund, advocating an increase in the military budget, advocated closing the budget gap. But advocate isn't only a verb, an advocate is someone who advocates for you, or argues on your side. Originally, this was often a lawyer in court, and in Britain advocate is still a term for lawyer. Vociferous. Making noisy or emphatic outcries. Whenever the referee at these soccer games makes a questionable call, you hear vociferous protests from half the parents. A vociferous group shouts loudly and insistently, and they're usually not too happy about something. So, for example, we often hear about vociferous critics, vociferous demands, vociferous opponents, or a vociferous minority. When a small group makes itself vociferous enough, everyone else may even start thinking it's actually a majority. Faun is a Greek root meaning sound, voice, or speech. It's probably most familiar in the form of the English suffix phone, in words that begin with a Greek or Latin root as well. Thus, the tele in telephone means far, the micro in microphone means small, the xylo in xylophone means wood, and so on. Phonics. A method of teaching beginners to read and pronounce words by learning the characteristic sounds of letters, letter groups, and especially syllables. My son's school switched to phonics instruction several years ago, and reading achievement in the early grades has been improving. In the field of beginning reading, there are two basic schools of thought in the U.S. today. One emphasizes whole language teaching, which relies on teaching a lot of reading, the other emphasizes phonics, teaching how letters and syllables correspond to sounds. Phonics instruction may be especially difficult in English, since English has the most difficult spelling of any Western language. Consider the various ways we create the F sound in cough, photo, and giraffe, or the SH sound in special, issue, vicious, and portion, or the K sound in tack, quite, and shellac, and how we pronounce the O in do, core, lock, and bone, or the EA in lead, ocean, idea, and early. Teaching phonics obviously isn't an easy job, but it's probably an important one. Phonetic. Relating to or representing the sounds of the spoken language. In almost every Spanish word the pronunciation is clear from the spelling, so the phonetic part of learning Spanish isn't usually a big challenge. The English alphabet is phonetic, that is, the letters represent sounds. The Chinese alphabet, however, isn't phonetic, since its symbols represent ideas rather than sounds. But even in English, a letter doesn't always represent the same sound. The A in cat, father, and mate, for example, represents three different sounds. Because of this, books about words often use specially created phonetic alphabets in which each symbol stands for a single sound in order to represent pronunciations. So in this book, cat, father, and mate would be phonetically represented as cat, father, and mate. Polyphonic. Referring to a style of music in which two or more melodies are sung or played against each other in harmony. Whenever he needed something calming, he would put on some quiet polyphonic music from the Renaissance and just let the voices waft over him. Since poly means many, see poly, polyphonic music has many voices. In polyphony, each part has its own melody, and they weave together in a web that may become very dense. A famous piece by Thomas Tallis, composed around 1570, has 40 separate voice parts. Polyphony reached its height during the 16th century with Italian madrigals and the sacred music of such composers as Tallis, Palestrina, and Byrd. Usually when we speak of polyphony we're talking about music of Bach's time and earlier, but the principles remain the same today, and songwriters such as the Beatles have sometimes used polyphony as well. Cacophony. Harsh or unpleasant sound. In New York she was often dragged off by her boyfriend to downtown jazz concerts, where she struggled to make sense of what sounded like nothing but cacophony. Cacophony employs the Greek prefix kako, meaning bad, but not everything we call cacophonous is necessarily bad. Grunge, thrash, hardcore, and goth music are unlistenable to some people and very popular to others. Open-air food markets may be marked by a cacophony of voices but also by wonderful sights and sounds. On the other hand, few people can really enjoy, for more than a few minutes, the cacophony of jackhammers, car horns, and truck engines that assaults the city pedestrian on a hot day in August. Cur. From the Latin verb curare, means basically care for. Our verb cure comes from this root, as do manicure, care of the hands, and pedicure, care of the feet. Curative. Having to do with curing diseases. As soon as the antibiotic entered his system, he imagined he could begin to feel its curative effects. Medical researchers are finding curative substances in places that surprise them. Folklore has led to some new cures of old diseases, and natural substances never before tried have often proved effective. Quinine, which comes from a tree in the Andes, was the original drug for malaria. Aspirin's main ingredient came from willow bark, and Taxol, a drug used in treating several cancers, was originally extracted from the bark of a yew tree. The curative properties of these natural drugs are today duplicated in the laboratory. Curator. Someone in charge of something where things are on exhibit, such as a collection, a museum, or a zoo. In recent decades, zoo curators have tried to make the animal surroundings more and more like their natural homes. In a good-sized art museum, each curator is generally responsible for a single department or collection: European painting, Asian sculpture, Native American art, and so on. Curatorial duties include acquiring new artworks, caring for and repairing objects already owned, discovering frauds and counterfeits, lending artworks to other museums, and mounting exhibitions of everything from Greek sculpture to 20th-century clothing. Procure. To get possession of, obtain. Investigators were looking into the question of how the governor had procured such a huge loan at such a favorable rate. While procure has the general meaning of obtain, it usually implies that some effort is required. It may also suggest getting something through a formal set of procedures. In many business offices, a particular person is responsible for procuring supplies, and government agencies have formal procurement policies. When teenagers use an older friend to procure the wrong kind of supplies for their parties, they often risk getting into trouble. Sinecure. A job or position requiring little work but usually providing some income. The job of dean of students at any college is no sinecure. The hours can be long and the work draining. Sinecure contains the Latin word sine, without, and thus means without care. In some countries, the government in power may be free to award sinecure positions to their valued supporters. In other countries, this would be regarded as corruption. The positions occupied by British royalty are called sinecures by some people, who claim they enjoy their enormous wealth in return for nothing at all. But their many supporters point to the amount of public service, charitable, and ceremonial work they perform, not to mention the effort they put into promoting Britain to the world. Peri. In both Latin and Greek, means around. A period is often a span of time that keeps coming around regularly, day after day or year after year. With a periscope, you can see around corners. Peristalsis is the process that moves food around the intestines. Without it, digestion would grind to a halt. Perimeter. The boundary or distance around a body or figure. In a medieval siege, an army would surround the perimeter of a city's high walls, denying the population any food from outside as it assaulted the walls with catapults and battering rams. The perimeter of a prison is ringed with high walls and watchtowers, and the entire perimeter of Australia is bounded by water. In geometry, you may be asked to calculate the perimeter of various geometrical shapes. In basketball, the perimeter is the area beyond the free throw circle. A perimeter player tends to stay outside that circle. Try not to confuse this word with parameter, which usually means a rule or limit that controls what something is or how it can be done. Periodontal. Concerning or affecting the tissues around the teeth. Years of bad living had filled his teeth with cavities, but it was periodontal disease that finished them off. In dentistry, cavities are important, but they aren't the whole story. What happens to your gums is every bit as vital to your dental health. When you don't floss regularly to keep plaque from forming on your teeth and gums, the gums will slowly deteriorate. Dentists called periodontists specialize in the treatment of periodontal problems, and when the gums have broken down to the point where they can't hold the teeth in place, a periodontist may need to provide dental implants, a costly and unpleasant process. But even a periodontist can't keep your gums healthy. That job is up to you. Peripatetic. 1. Having to do with walking. 2. Moving or traveling from place to place. She spent her early adult years as a peripatetic musician, traveling from one engagement to another. The philosopher Aristotle had his school at the Lyceum Gymnasium in Athens. The Lyceum may have resembled the Parthenon in being surrounded by a row of columns, or colonnade, which the Greeks would have called a peripatoi. Aristotle was also said to have paced slowly while teaching, and the Greek word for pacing was peripatos. And finally, peripatos meant simply discussion. Whatever the source of the word, Aristotle and his followers became known as the Peripatetics, and the pacing sense led to peripatetic's English meaning of traveling or moving about. Johnny Appleseed is a good example of a peripatetic soul, and peripatetic executives and salespeople today stare into their laptop computers while endlessly flying from city to city. Peripheral. 1. Having to do with the outer edges, especially of the field of vision. 2. Secondary or supplemental. Like most good fourth-grade teachers, he had excellent peripheral vision, and the kids were convinced that he had eyes in the back of his head. Your peripheral vision is the outer area of your field of vision, where you can still detect movement and shapes. It can be very valuable when, for instance, you're driving into Chicago at rush hour, especially when switching lanes. When people call an issue in a discussion peripheral, they mean that it's not of primary importance, and they're probably suggesting that everyone get back to the main topic. Peripheral is now also a noun. Computer peripherals are the added components, printers, webcams, microphones, etc., that increase a computer's capacities. Sens comes from the Latin noun sensus, meaning feeling or sense. Sense itself obviously comes straight from the Latin. A sensation is something you sense. And if you're sensitive, you feel or sense things sharply, maybe even too sharply. Sensor. A device that detects a physical quantity, such as a movement or a beam of light, and responds by transmitting a signal. The outdoor lights are triggered by a motion sensor that detects changes in infrared energy given off by moving human bodies. Sensors are used today almost everywhere. Radar guns bounce microwaves off moving cars. A burglar alarm may use a photosensor to detect when a beam of light has been broken, or may use ultrasonic sound waves that bounce off moving objects. Still other sensors may detect pressure, barometers, or chemicals, breathalyzers and smoke detectors. Stud finders, used by carpenters to locate wooden studs under a wall, may employ magnets or radar. Wired gloves, which relay information about the position of the fingers, are used in virtual reality environments. A cheap car alarm may be nothing but a shock sensor, in which a strong vibration will cause two metal surfaces to come together. Desensitize. To cause someone or something to react less to or be less affected by something. Even squeamish nursing students report becoming desensitized to the sight of blood after a few months of training. Physical desensitizing is something that biologists have long been aware of. Basic training in the armed forces tries to desensitize new recruits to pain. We can desensitize ourselves to the summer heat by turning off the air conditioning, or become desensitized to the cold by walking barefoot in the snow. But desensitize is more often used when talking about negative emotions. Parents worry that their children will be desensitized to violence by playing video games. Soldiers may become desensitized to death on the battlefield. Desensitizing may be natural and desirable under some circumstances, but maybe not so good in others. Extrasensory. Not acting or occurring through any of the known senses. A kind of extrasensory capacity seems to tell some soldiers when danger is near. Since extra means outside, beyond, see extra, extrasensory means basically beyond the senses. Extrasensory perception, or ESP, usually includes communication between minds involving no obvious contact, telepathy, gaining information about something without using the normal senses, clairvoyance, or predicting the future, precognition. According to polls, about 40% of Americans believe in ESP, and many of them have had personal experiences that seem to prove its existence. When someone jumps into your mind months or years after you had last thought of him or her, and the next day you learn that the person has just died, it can be hard to convince yourself it was just coincidence. Still, scientific attempts to prove the existence of ESP have never been terribly successful. Sensuous. 1. Highly pleasing to the senses. 2. Relating to the senses. Part of what audiences loved about her was the delight she took in the sensuous pleasures of well-prepared food. Sensuous and sensual are close in meaning but not identical, and sensuous was actually coined by the poet John Milton so that he wouldn't have to use sensual. Sensuous usually implies pleasing of the senses by art or similar means. Great music, for example, can be a source of sensuous delight. Sensual, on the other hand, usually describes gratification of the senses or physical appetites as an end in itself. Thus we often think, perhaps unfairly, of wealthy Romans leading lives devoted to sensual pleasure. You can see why the Puritan Milton might have wanted another word. Soph. Come from the Greek words meaning wise and wisdom. In English the root sometimes appears in words where the wisdom is of the wise guy variety, but in words such as philosophy we see it used more respectfully. Sophistry. Cleverly deceptive reasoning or argument. For lawyers and politicians, the practice of sophistry from time to time is almost unavoidable. The Sophists were a group of Greek teachers of rhetoric and philosophy, famous during the 5th century BC, who moved from town to town offering their teaching for a fee. The Sophists originally represented a respectable school of philosophy, but some critics claimed that they tried to persuade by means of clever but misleading arguments. The philosopher Plato wrote negatively about them, and the comic dramatist Aristophanes made fun of them, showing them making ridiculously fine distinctions about word meanings. We get our modern meanings of sophist, sophistry, and the adjective sophistical mostly from the opinions of these two men. Sophisticated. 1. Having a thorough knowledge of the ways of society. 2. Highly complex or developed. In Woman of the Year, Katharine Hepburn plays a sophisticated journalist who can handle everything except Spencer Tracy. A sophisticated argument is thorough and well worked out. A satellite is a sophisticated piece of technology, complex and designed to accomplish difficult tasks. A sophisticated person, such as Humphrey Bogart in Casablanca, knows how to get around in the world. But sophistication isn't always admired. As you might guess, the word is closely related to sophistry, see above, and its original meanings weren't very positive, and still today many of us aren't sure we really like sophisticates. Sophomoric. Overly impressed with one's own knowledge, but in fact undereducated and immature. We can't even listen to those sophomoric songs of his, with their attempts at profound wisdom that just demonstrate how little he knows about life. Sophomoric seems to include the roots soph, wise, and moros, fool, seen in words such as moron, so the contrast between wisdom and ignorance is built right into the word. Cambridge University introduced the term sophomore for its second-year students in the 17th century, though it's no longer used in Britain, maybe to suggest that a sophomore has delusions of wisdom since he's no longer an ignorant freshman. In America today, sophomore is ambiguous since it can refer to either high school or college. But sophomoric should properly describe something, wit, behavior, arguments, etc., that is at least trying to be sophisticated. Theosophy. A set of teachings about God and the world based on mystical insight, especially teachings founded on a blend of Buddhist and Hindu beliefs. He had experimented with a number of faiths, starting with Buddhism and ending with a mixture of Eastern and Western thought, that could best be called theosophy. The word theosophy, combining roots meaning God and wisdom, appeared back in the 17th century, but the well-known religious movement by that name, under the leadership of the Russian Helena Blavatsky, appeared only around 1875. Blavatsky's theosophy combined elements of Plato's philosophy with Christian, Buddhist, and Hindu thought, including reincarnation, in a way that she claimed had been divinely revealed to her. The Theosophical Society, founded in 1875 to promote her beliefs, still exists, as does the Anthroposophical Society, founded by her follower Rudolf Steiner. Words from mythology and history. Achilles' heel. A vulnerable point. By now his rival for the Senate seat had discovered his Achilles' heel, the court records of the terrible divorce he had gone through 10 years earlier. When the hero Achilles was an infant, his sea nymph mother dipped him into the river Styx to make him immortal. But since she held him by one heel, this spot did not touch the water and so remained mortal and vulnerable, and it was here that Achilles was eventually mortally wounded. Today, the tendon that stretches up the calf from the heel is called the Achilles tendon. But the term Achilles heel isn't used in medicine. Instead, it's only used with the general meaning, weak point, for instance, to refer to a section of a country's borders that aren't militarily protected, or to a Jeopardy contestant's ignorance in the sports category. Arcadia. A region or setting of rural pleasure and peacefulness. The Pocono Mountains of Pennsylvania are a vacationer's Arcadia. Arcadia, a beautiful rural area in Greece, became the favorite setting for poems about ideal innocence unaffected by the passions of the larger world, beginning with the works of the Roman poet Virgil. There, shepherds play their pipes and sigh with longing for flirtatious nymphs, shepherdesses sing to their flocks, and goat-footed nature gods play in the fields and woods. Today, city dwellers who hope to retire to a country house often indulge in Arcadian fantasies about what rural life will be like. Cassandra. A person who predicts misfortune or disaster. They used to call him a Cassandra because he often expected the worst, but his predictions tended to come true. Cassandra, the daughter of King Priam of Troy, was one of those beautiful young maidens with whom Apollo fell in love. He gave her the gift of prophecy in return for the promise of her sexual favors, but at the last minute she refused him. Though he could not take back his gift, he angrily pronounced that no one would ever believe her predictions, so when she prophesied the fall of her city to the Greeks and the death of its heroes, she was laughed at by the Trojans. A modern-day Cassandra goes around predicting gloom and doom, and may turn out to be right some of the time. Cyclopean. Huge or massive. They're imagining a new medical center on a cyclopean scale, a vast 10-block campus with 30 high-rise buildings. The Cyclopes of Greek mythology were huge, crude giants, each with a single eye in the middle of his forehead. Odysseus and his men had a terrible encounter with a Cyclops, and escaped utter disaster only by stabbing a burning stick into the monster's eye. The great stone walls at such ancient sites as Troy and Mycenae are called Cyclopean because the stones are so massive and the construction, which uses no cement, is so expert that it was assumed that only a superhuman race such as the Cyclopes could have achieved such a feat. Draconian. Extremely severe or cruel. The severe punishments carried out in Saudi Arabia, including flogging for drunkenness, hand amputation for robbery, and beheading for drug trafficking, strike most of the world as draconian. Draconian comes from the name of Draco, a leader of Athens in the 7th century BC who in 621 BC produced its first legal code. The punishments he prescribed were extraordinarily harsh. Almost anyone who couldn't pay his debts became a slave, and even minor crimes were punishable by death. So severe were these penalties that it was said that the code was written in blood. In the next century, the wise leader Solon would revise all of Draco's code, retaining the death penalty only for the crime of murder. Myrmidon. A loyal follower, especially one who executes orders unquestioningly. To an American, these soldiers were like myrmidons, all too eager to do the beloved leader's bidding. In the Trojan War, the troops of the great hero Achilles were called myrmidons. As bloodthirsty as wolves, they were the fiercest fighters in all Greece. They were said to have come from the island of Aegina, where, after the island's entire population had been killed by a plague, it was said to have been repopulated by Zeus, by turning all the ants in a great anthill into men. Because of their insect origin, the Myrmidons were blindly loyal to Achilles, so loyal that they would die without resisting if ordered to. The Trojans would not be the last fighting force to believe that a terrifying opposing army was made up of men who were not quite human. Nemesis. A powerful, frightening opponent or rival who is usually victorious. During the 1970s and 80s, Japanese carmakers became the nemesis of the U.S. auto industry. The Greek goddess Nemesis doled out rewards for noble acts and vengeance for evil ones, but it's only her vengeance that anyone remembers. According to the Greeks, Nemesis did not always punish an offender right away, but might wait as much as 5 generations to avenge a crime. Regardless, her cause was always just and her eventual victory was sure. But today a nemesis doesn't always dispense justice. A powerful drug lord may be the nemesis of a Mexican police chief, for instance, just as Ernst Stavro Blofeld was James Bond's nemesis in 3 of Ian Fleming's novels. Trojan horse. Someone or something that works from within to weaken or defeat. Researchers are working on a kind of Trojan horse that will be welcomed into the diseased cells and then destroy them from within. After besieging the walls of Troy for 10 years, the Greeks built a huge, hollow wooden horse, secretly filled it with armed warriors, and presented it to the Trojans as a gift for the goddess Athena, and the Trojans took the horse inside the city's walls. That night, the armed Greeks swarmed out and captured and burned the city. A Trojan horse is thus anything that looks innocent but, once accepted, has power to harm or destroy, for example, a computer program that seems helpful but ends up corrupting or demolishing the computer's software.